Hello again. Hello again, live from Sorbonne University. We are delighted to meet again after this morning session, which was very dense. We are resuming our work with several sessions. But before we start, it is my pleasure to receive Xavier Ducrest de Villeneuve, the chair of Alliance Urgence organization, which basically you'll be sending out a call to the youth on behalf of and for the the NGOs, the organization, the non-profit organizations you are advocating and promoting. Thank you, Pascal, and thank you for giving me the floor. Alliance Urgence and its NGOs, Handicap International, Action contre la faim, Médecins du Monde, CARE, Solidarité Internationale, and Plan International, and we've been engaged in more than 70 countries, more than 2,000 projects, more than 10,000 salaried employees to work the world over to support vulnerable populations and communities, to the disenfranchised, to the excluded, those post-crisis or engaged in a systemic crisis. I wanted to repeat what was said this morning. What do we offer those young people who engage in medical professions? What do we offer our youth who can fully engage and fully invest in themselves? Basically, we can offer to engage in a fight, in being in an activist world, to engage in the world. And we are lucky enough to have Danielle Cohn-Bendit with us later, who has had a lifetime in activism, and who knows what activism is about. And they are, like us, aware of vulnerability of the humankind. The fight we advocate, the fight we want to offer them is not just the climate issues, global warming. It's one health, one world, one planet, to engage in the sustainability development goals, the SDGs. And this is the three-party goal we want to engage the youth for and with. So, and our 6 NGOs are included in Alliance Urgency. And we want them to link up between the urgency of the fight and the actual fight. It is imperative that we are interdependent and active one with another. If we don't deal with the global south and the weakness and the vulnerability of the global south, we need to tackle these issues. We need to show solidarity with these communities. This is what I wanted to tell the youth. We wanted to engage with us. Thank you, Xavier. It was of importance that we set the scene and that you bring this symposium under the impetus and the umbrella leadership of your alliance. And then you'll be sending out a call to the health professionals after having done so for the students and for the youth. Now, jointly with Gilles Rod, we'll be opening up the second session for our symposium, the afternoon session. And Gilles Rod, you'll be calling on the various speakers to join us on the stage. So 34 years after the launch and the success of the Erasmus program to ensure the mobility of staff, faculty and students within the European Union, the new Erasmus Plus 2021-27 Erasmus program focuses on social inclusion, digital transition and the promotion of youth participation, democracy and democratic life. How does the new Erasmus Plus program meet the needs and requirements of medical students? One topical aspect is with respect to the well-being, comfort and convenience of students during their studies in Europe, especially during the COVID pandemic, which especially affected them and engaged them. What solutions can be thought through? What are the obstacles to mobility for the French students going out of their countries and for the non-French students students wanting to study in France. How do universities and health institutions can meet these issues and answer these questions with innovative solutions? What's the place and role for common joint medical curricula across European education institutions? Is harmonization desirable? What role and place for medical curricula in English language, which would be adapted to the joint curricula of medical studies to prepare for mobility for students, making the training and education programs, making them attractive for non-French students, and what shared and common values for these international and French students in sync and in line with democratic values, and to address these social and societal issues. These aspects, issues, questions, and challenges will be addressed by the various speakers we'll have on our first panel today. And it is my pleasure to call Victoire Morel and Danielle Cohn-Bendit, a former European Member of Parliament and exemplary teacher outside.
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone.
La grande chance en ce début
We are fortunate enough early this afternoon to have with us two eminent European personalities, with Danielle Cohn-Bendit here in person and Enrico Letta from Rome in Italy remotely, to try and address the question in front of us: can Europe still attract and charm students and be profitable to them? Danielle Cohn-Bendit, all of Europe knows you, especially France and Germany. You are the leading figurehead of the May 1968 event. You've been a European Member of Parliament and you still are a passionate European. Enrico Letta, you can hear us, we can't see you, but you were Prime Minister of Italy. You also were a European Member of Parliament, and you are the President of the Jacques Delors Institute, one of the most active European think tanks. Now, we have with us 6 European students who wanted to engage in a discussion with you and have prepared a number of very ambitious questions, ranging from questioning the European identity to questions on Erasmus as a program, going through the political representation of youth in Europe. So quite a vast agenda that we'll try and address within the next 40 minutes via this intergenerational discussion between those who have built up yesterday's and today's Europe and those who are currently founding and will be founding tomorrow's Europe. We want to contribute to what seems to us what is critical, to make it possible for youth to live better, to get better educated and trained, and to have exciting projects guiding them. Enrico Letta, buongiorno and grazie di esserci con noi. I will give you the floor in the first stage. Then I will give the floor to Danielle Cohn-Bendit, who will be introducing, the two of you, you'll be introducing our discussion. You'll have 5 minutes, respectively, and then the students will ask you the question they've prepared. Enrico Letta, you have the floor. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you. Unfortunately, I cannot see you, but I can hear you loud and clear, which is the most important thing, and I hope you can hear me well. Now, I will focus the 5 minutes which have been allotted to me on one critical aspect. The critical aspect is that we've seen 2 unprecedented crises, one after the other, in the next 10 years, which had one generation only experienced 2 crises, 2 heavy-duty, very harsh crisis, the economic and financial crisis, which was followed by the health crisis connected with the COVID pandemic. These 2 crises being so harsh that usually you would get one such harsh crisis per generation. Well, we had just one generation of youth who experienced these two combined crises, who never had a moment of rest and peace as we had ourselves in the previous decade. This brings me to say that the center of European politics and the center of key political ideas and notions going forward must be youth and must be focusing on youth for a very simple reason. We must make sure that youth have the capacity to recover from these two very harsh crises, to recover from existential precariousness, which has become the new normal for them, fatigue as well, with respect to connections and relations with the labor market and with their studies and with the factor of mobility. And next to this, in addition to this, the European Union experienced very hard and harsh difficulties in the past decade. So basically, it is important that we focus centrally on youth in the future European policies. So number one, I think we need to focus our major collective efforts in Europe on the what I would call next generation EU version 2. We had next generation Union.1 with some 750 billion euros for the first generation of youth under Erasmus. But today the defect is that we have 27 national plans which mainly are focusing on their national respective agendas with nothing European in them. The only European way connected with this program is that the source of money is centralized and coming from top-down Europe, but the way to implement these activities are mainly national. But in the world, there will be three centers in the world: the Americans, the Chinese, and we, the Europeans. And we as Europeans need to develop common joint programs, projects, and activities, moving away from national level domestic programs and activities which won't enable us to break away from the dynamics of competition with the Americans and with the Chinese. So the difficulty will be to come up with large European level projects and programs. In the 7 years I spent with the French Political Sciences Institute until the month of March 2021, when I decided to go back to Italy. In the 7 years I spent in Paris, in France, we saw things moving, and I saw the beginnings of European programs and projects seeing the light of day. And Sorbonne University sees what I'm talking about, but they are too thin projects. We need to have European universities for European programs in order to have European innovation centers, in order to have European level investment centers, places and venues which can attract people from all over Europe and which can become global venue to attract people the world over. So my own program, my own project is that we need to have a next generation EU version 2, which will be geared to and driven by and focusing on the European youth, the European issues, the European agendas, which won't just be the Sorbonne University attracting youth from other countries or the Pisa University attracting youth from other countries, but that we really have European level organizations, universities and centers. And my last point, and I will conclude with this, I saw that the ALMA project was launched for the Erasmus engaged youth, the NE for the youth who are engaged in NEET studies. I think this is a good thing, but we need to do more. The key question is not to limit mobility moves to those who already are in studies in the higher education system, in universities which already have mobility mechanisms in their DNAs. We need to do more. We need to make sure mobility and traveling is made accessible to all these high school, junior high school students aged 14, 15, 16, 17, and giving them the possibility to move around Europe and to travel. If we don't do that, we will be limiting mobility in Europe and traveling in Europe to one generation, which somehow is an elite portion of the generation, leaving aside a large chunk of the youth population, the largest chunk of this youth, which can't afford moving around and traveling, and which remain stuck in their own respective scope. If we don't do that, everything else will be blah blah and rhetorics. And after Acceleration EU programs, which was a major booster, we are retreating, we are retrenching. So starting with the youth, starting from you young people, we need to move forward. Thank you very much, Enrico Letta. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, you have the floor.
Bonjour.
Hello, everyone. I agree with Enrico. Yet, I would like to go back one step. When you ask whether we can give the desire of Europe for young people, but the main question is, do people still desire Europe? Is there still a desire for Europe for everyone? Is there a need for Europe? Is there a necessity for Europe? Because at the end of the day, people can stay in their own nations, in their own states, and just work on building up their own countries. But when we speak about sovereignty for the European member states, they no longer have the notion of sovereignty. The only possibility for sovereignty is the European sovereignty level. So the European space, the European area, for us becomes the arena, the space which gives us a breath of fresh air and which gives us the ability to live and work independently. This is fundamental to understand. It can this can be said for the defense sector, for the economic sector, for the research sector. It can be applicable to all sectors. Now, I've been advocating the advent of a federal European state for many, many years. I might never see it, but we are making headway towards such a notion. What is fundamental when you speak about youth, young people, and when you speak to young people is about how making sure that youth can discover this multitude of possibilities that Europe offers us, that Europe offers them. Europe is a great breeding ground for learning, for experiencing, for living, for having fun. I know we keep talking about developing schools and universities in order for youth to learn, but nothing will happen if there's no desire and curiosity to learn from other countries. Of course, you educate yourself and you train yourself to give yourself possibilities to move on in one's respective life. But what's interesting in the Erasmus programs, I remember in election campaigns, every time I would be discussing with students, and especially Erasmus students, I realized that 30 or 40% would get married across European nationalities. So Europe is the possibility to move outside of the restricted space of your national space, whether it be as large as the national space of Germany or France, or whether it is a bit smaller, smaller like the national space of Luxembourg. And for young people, knowing that I'm not so young anymore, but I think that there is a willingness and a desire by youth in Europe to know something else and to discover something else. And Europe should enable this and allow this. Now, Enrico's proposal, calling for a proposal and a proposition for European youth, I answer yes, but this proposition shouldn't be limited to schooling and universities. But what Enrico said about traveling and moving around is fundamental. Enabling young Europeans aged 15 or 16 to travel across Europe during the summer holidays, for example, at no cost, at €0, to basically collectively invest in offering mobility to help youth discover Europe. And if they do that before they engage in higher education studies or high school studies, then you have a better notion of why you want to engage in your studies and what is of interest as well. And we saw that during the very harsh pandemic crisis is that the means and resources for protecting oneself in Europe were very different depending where you lived. So I don't want to engage in some kind of Olympic Games benchmark with a list of fame between who did better between the Germans, the French, the Danes, the Swedes, and I won't do that. But somehow we saw that Europeans at large found it difficult to overcome their national limits, despite the fact that this pandemic crisis, that this virus crossed borders and moved around extremely easily, crossing borders each day, each hour, and even each minute. So, and we were not capable as Europeans to do the same. And to responsibly, I think the interest for Europe, the eagerness and curiosity for Europe would be a possibility to extend outside of the respective national borders. Let me give you an example. A country like France or Italy has imposed a health pass to its populations with the consequences it has had on the youth. Other countries like Germany have not made the same choice and have not imposed a health pass. What are the consequences? When we speak about the pandemic, I think we haven't spoken enough about these issues. Why do the greater number of youth, starting from age 12, 13 or 14, want to get vaccinated? The large majority of these youth want to be vaccinated, who have fewer doubts as to the efficacy of the vaccines. Basically, they are fed up with the test. Every time they want to do some sports or to go out to a restaurant or whatever, they need to get, they are required to get tested. So being vaccinated frees them from getting tested. And this is where Europe can be interesting, as it will enable them to see what is different. And it's really worthwhile, and this will be my concluding remark, to experience living in another European countries for 1 or 2 years. If you like jazz and Belgium, you should go to the Baltic states and see this extraordinary jazz culture. I'm giving you this example because it is one of the less well-known examples. I could cite many other examples. But what is horrible, and I agree with what Enrico said, is that in the last few years, the Erasmus budget has been reduced. So we have the impression that the lawmakers and political leaders are totally disconnected in a time like today's times. We should be expanding the budget of Erasmus. We should be expanding the scope of Erasmus, and we should make sure that Erasmus Plus programs are extended to other types of youth, not just university youth, but also to apprentices and to work-study trainees. Now, does Europe inspire people? Does it generate desire? I would say yes, but in order to meet this desire and to enable youth to meet this desire, we need to invest more financial resources into it. So lots has already been said, so we will dig deeper into these aspects jointly with the students. We'll take a first series of 3 questions which will be asked. So first 3 questions, then we'll get the answers, and then we'll take the next 3 questions. Elena Di Castro from Sapienza, you are on an Erasmus exchange program in Paris. So what are your questions? And then we'll take the other 3. What took me to travel from the suburb of Rome to the Sorbonne University and to the French Political Sciences Institute is not accessible to everyone. The financial obstacles to participating in Erasmus and the higher education system are there. With the COVID crisis, the financial obstacles got even worse. Young people have been particularly affected by the COVID pandemic and has isolated them more, forcing some of the young people to stop their studies. Daniel Cohn-Bendit, I'm talking to you. As you know, Italy, France, and Germany very well. Have you perceived in those 3 different countries that European youth, or that the youth in those countries felt ill at ease and felt uncomfortable and disenfranchised? This feeling of disenfranchisement in German, Italian, and French youth. Okay. Mr. Di Casanova, you are the representative of the ISNI organization. Yes, thank you very much. I think that you have partly answered my question already. My own personal example is when I felt the most European is when I engaged in a youth camp in Ernstadt near Cologne in Germany, when I found myself next to German and Italian youth, and we had fun. We did silly things and we drank too much beer. But let us be clear, connections and friendly feelings do not develop via Instagram connections and links. They get developed by way of direct contact with people, having fun and drinking beer and speaking and mingling. Now, much has been said about Erasmus, and I agree. In order to build up Europe, people have to buy into the European idea and concept. It starts with the projects I'm engaged in, but the other difficulty is that there's a need to make Europe intelligible with respect to institutions, with respect to its activities. I'm a lawyer by training. For a year and a half, I learned about European institutions, but today I'm unable to tell you about what are the European institutions in full detail. So the complexity of the European Union and its organizations makes it difficult to make Europe understandable and legible. Now, those people using Erasmus programs and similar programs are youth engaged in higher education systems, representing privileged social classes, generally high-income people. So how can we break down these barriers of inequality so that we can build up a better Europe together? A question on the malaise of young people and differences between countries, how to make Europe more intelligible, more understandable. And we have a question by François Diff, who is a pharmaceutical student, who is the representative of the ANEMF Association. Yes, hello. So as you mentioned in what you said, university exchange programs are an integral part of university lives of students, and they are the most practical ways for students to understand and engage with the European portion of their curricula. So it is critical that each student can access these programs and embrace their European identities and citizenship. So my organization called ANEF is the Association of Pharmaceutical Students. In the health studies, there's very strong differences between those students engaged in health-related studies versus other medical studies. For health-related studies, there is greater disparities and differences and lack of harmonization between training pathways. Gentlemen, my questions are as follows. How can we make health-related faculty and policymakers that it is now time to take action? How can we motivate authorities to advocate these exchange programs and invest more greatly in developing these exchange programs, which will be a building block to developing a One Health Europe? Enrico Letta, would you like to respond, or Daniel Cohn-Bendit? Well, he is the former Prime Minister. It is up to Enrico Letta to start. Okay, Enrico, please answer either one of the questions or the three of them.
Il est parti manger des spaghettis.
Un mot sur les trois. Le premier mot pour
a quick word for all three of you. For Irene first, I think there are huge discrepancies. If you look at what's happening in France, Germany and Italy, in terms of the first job, it's incredible what's happening. In Italy, we have a huge problem, which is that in the past decades, we've put internship and apprenticeship superimposed one on another. So people start, young people start working by doing work placements or internships, and it's a disaster. So I think, and that's our proposal, the proposal we've just made, the work placement or the internship has to be part of the course of studies. An apprenticeship and other ways to get onto the job market have to be a real way onto the job market, and this is really the red line I'm putting, because young people are really marginalized in Italy, and I see a huge difference compared to what happens in France and Germany. Regarding what Gaëtan said, I'm thinking of and I'm picking up on what Daniel said, because I think we have to sound the alarm. Political decision makers are keeping silent on the conference on the future of Europe with this, with the citizens that are part of it. It's a potential success, but nobody's talking about it. And the key issue is that out of this conference there has to come transnational lists, which means that myself, Danielle and others, we have to be able to be candidates across Europe. So European citizens have to be able to vote for their national lists, but also for European lists of candidates. And I think that would change everything. The Conference on the Future of Europe has also mentioned the necessity for a European health policy. I think that would be a huge achievement. It should have been the case, but because of Britain and others that had vetoed it, we never had a European health. There no longer is any alibi, and I think the answer to what François Dib said, we need European health, and it has to go through universities. Universities have an essential role to play, and I'll stop here.
Je voudrais répondre aux deux premières questions.
I'd like to answer the first two questions with a
C'est-à-dire
proposition.
comment on prépare cette
How can we prepare that mobility? What I
Allemagne,
advocate for in France and in Germany
une année
is
sociale
a social year that every young person from the age of 16, whether they be apprentices between the ages of 16 and 19. So a social year during which that young person would work
pour le bien commun.
for the common good.
Ce travail social
And that social work
doit avoir une forte
could have and should have a strong European dimension. What I mean by that is that if Europe decides and then all nations agree that there will be 1 year of social work for every young person, then you'll get financing to do it in another country, or you could do 6 months in one European country and 6 months in another European country. That would be a great thing to leverage to get young people to understand that the common good is not only national but European, and that we need that European common good. Because we're told there'll be a military service. Well, I don't care whether they want to have a military service or not, but I think a social service would be a lot more educational and formative than a military service. We should talk about defense, and that's another story altogether. But if we dream a bit, and if there could be millions of young people every year who, thanks to financing, to a grant, go to spend 6 months in a kindergarten, or to work the land, or to work in another European country, then you through that what you achieve is European awareness for all generations. My dad, my father, was a lawyer. He emigrated out of Germany in 1933. He was a lawyer, and when he came to France, he couldn't be a lawyer. He would have had to take his leaving certificate from high school again after the war. And today there are equivalents, and medical studies and pharmacy studies are a problem today across countries. And I think what they had thought in the Bologna process, we should guarantee that there be equivalence between degrees across European countries. That is the condition that will make it possible for young people to go from one country to another. So we'll move on to the next 3 questions. Jonas Nickel, you're a student at the Humboldt University in Berlin. You're in an exchange in Paris. Yes. Well, I want to quote Jacques Delors and Ursula von der Leyen, who asked themselves how to create a European consciousness amongst young people. And Ursula von der Leyen talks about a generation that wants us to go further and faster to solve the climate crisis. She mentions the possibility of young people coming together under the banner of the defense of the environment. Do you think that the green awareness and environmental awareness will help us regain a collective consciousness? And I'm thinking of young people, bearing in mind that the challenges are worldwide, they're global challenges. And when political parties, and in particular green political parties, how can they position themselves
un exemple porté majoritairement par étudiants et des
towards young people. I'm thinking of movements that are led by young people against traditional political parties, and the Green parties are not excluded.
Une question à poser qui revient d'ailleurs sur.
I think Aja Drissi has also a question. Aja Drissi,
De Bologne, on échangeait par les chercher.
you're just next to me. Sorry, I was looking for you. You are at the University of Bologna and in exchange in Paris. Hello, everybody. I think in many European countries there's the problem with representation of young people in politics. The average age of members of parliament in Europe is 50. At the Italian parliament, the percentage of people under 30 is 1%, and the average age of members of parliament in France is almost 63. At the same time, young people in Europe.
Vous avez les chiffres pour l'Allemagne?
Do you have the figures for Germany? I think they're a little bit younger. 47.9. Ah, it is a bit better. So their members of parliament are a bit younger in Germany. Well, as I was saying, young people say they feel more and more disappointed by political decision makers and political parties. Since I know that you put at the center of your speeches young people and the way young people relate to politics, I know Mr. Letta set up a political studies institute, and it's my privilege to study there. How do you intend to rebuild trust of young people for political parties? Don't you think that European institutions should play a decisive role in that? And a question by Alexandra Podvarkova, also a student at the Humboldt University in Berlin in exchange in Paris. And I think she has a piece of advice to give you.
Alexandra.
Bonjour. Yeah, we're obviously currently living in a crucial time and in a time of change with several problems we were talking about. And I have a more personal question I wanted to address to you, which is, from your personal experience leading several protests and student groups in the 1960s, what characteristics do you think European students need to focus on in order to make a difference and reach their goals? And in contrast to that, is there anything you would recommend not to do to reach their political goals?
Thank you, Alexandra. Daniel Combini, vous voulez répondre?
Oui,
Do you want to answer? Well, I have two questions, if I understood correctly.
Moi, et vous allez voir que ma première
And you'll
réponse
see that
fera écho
my
à
first
la
answer
dernière
will
question.
echo the last
C'est le
question.
privilège
You
des
know,
jeunes
it's the privilege of
de
young
demander le
people
plus possible.
to ask as much as possible.
Moi, maintenant, je dis, c'est le privilège des
And
jeunes.
now I want to say, it's the privilege of young people to say stupid
Il ne
things.
faut pas croire que parce
Well,
qu'on
that's the
est
way it
jeune,
is. It's not
on ne
because
dit
you're
que
young
des
people that you're only going to speak the truth.
On a des pulsions.
You know, you
des
feel
mouvements,
impulses,
Fridays for Future,
and Friday for
répond
Future
justement à une anxiété
answers is a response because of there's an anxiety.
si la
What is going to
dégradation-
happen
le réchauffement climatique
if
continue, la
climate
dégradation
change
de la
goes on, and what's going to happen to planet Earth if global warming gets worse and worse. And it strikes people after the pandemic, when they've been actually in lockdown for a year and a half.
qui pouvaient pas se rencontrer dans les
You know, they couldn't meet meet at the university, so it was a major problem. So there was an anxiety that was totally understandable. And from that anxiety comes a radicality, a radical movement.
de la lutte contre le
But
réchauffement
the whole problem
que vous
of
pouvez pas
fighting climate change and global warming is that you cannot build politics against the majority of citizens. And that's, you know, the fact that young people feel the need much more than other generations to go further rather than older people, people who risk losing their jobs. And what irritates me with politics, with politicians, rather,
leur programme,
you know,
mais qu'ils
they wanted to build their platforms and their programs, okay, but they should know how to speak to the citizens, to the private citizens, and tell them, we understand your anxiety, and rest assured that every time we take measures, we'll be listening to you and we'll rectify if it goes too fast or not far enough. So politics is also experimenting. There is no such thing as the political truth. So when you have on the one hand young people pushing hard and political decision makers who need to make decisions, there is something positive that can come out of it if you accept these different positions. And let me tell you, this is my advice: none. I'm not Baden-Powell and my Scouts outfit, who, when he was 80, was still giving advice to Scouts all around the world. Young people are young people. I'm an old white male. I'm 76, and the idea that because, you know, we had the Sorbonne, and 3 centuries ago there was the May 68 movement, and there was my youth, and I cannot give advice. I can talk about my experience. I can talk about the stupid things we said. You know, when I talk about that May 68 movement, I tell about one stupid thing. I wasn't a Maoist, but there were Mao supporters who wanted to fight an authoritarian regime, and they felt that the French society under de Gaulle was an authoritarian. And to give as a counterexample the Cultural Revolution in China that caused millions of deaths, we must have been completely stupid. We must have been completely daft. And this is when I say that my generation should be careful. We should be cautious. Talk about great things. Yes, it's true that we took part in a liberation movement. And, you know, what's great with young people is that they have the right to say everything. Doesn't mean that what they say is right, but they can express their will. And what I think is extraordinary when we talk about institutions and old institutions. There was one event in Germany that was extraordinary. The Supreme Court in Germany, they're not exactly young people. They recognized that the environmental policy of the German government went against the interests and the freedom and the future of the young people. And I thought that was extraordinary, because that's where the will of the young people met, and one of the most renowned institutions who said, the young people are right. Enrico Letta, of course, we wish we could have had more time, but there's a panel discussion right afterwards. Enrico Letta, did you want to say anything in answer to what the questions that were asked? Well, hats down to Daniel. He said something really important, and I wish there were more people saying what he's just said. The world would be a better place. So hats off. Well done, Daniel. One thing I'd like to say, and I think it's important, we need more young people in institutions. How can we engineer that? I think we should exaggerate a little bit. What do I mean by that? In countries such as mine, there are quotas to have gender equality. Why not establish quotas to make it compulsory to have young people who would be under 30 at the parliament? I think it would be exceptional. I would call it a blue quota of young people who would sit in parliament and who would bring the voice of young people. On sustainability, it's a voice that has a long-term vision by definition, because people who are 20 years old will live another 90 years, whereas people who are much older now do not have the same life expectancy. So a quota for young people in parliament is my proposition. And the last point, what Hajar and Jonas said, I think we should strengthen participatory democracy. Participatory democracy is something that is better and stronger than representational democracy. And at the same time, it's not direct democracy that can be instrumentalized easily. So participatory democracy also uses a new and also use new digital tools, and young people are, they're very used to these digital technologies. It's a little example of what we're currently doing. We've launched a process of participatory democracy. They're called democratic agoras in Italy. Together with the Commission and what was invented by the municipality of Barcelona, and I think that's what we need to do. But the main question is what Danielle has just said. We shouldn't give you advice. We should be ready to the fact that you're going to take things in your own hands and seize on the possibility to get to assume responsibilities and make mistakes. The list of mistakes I've made in my long political life before I came to Paris and then came back here is a very long list of mistakes. So it's over to you to make your mistakes, and they'll be probably a lot less negative than mine. One sentence. It's frustrating. It's too short. I don't want to give advice, but I could tell you stories. So I suggest we meet up in the afternoon or in the evening, and we can chat, and then we can have something to eat and something to drink, and we go on chatting about our experience. This is only the beginning. Let's keep up with that. Keep that conversation going. Well, we have to leave the floor to the next panel discussion. It will be moderated by Jean Sibylia and Véronique Lecointe, and still chaired by Gilles Rode. Yes, Gilles Rode will be announcing what's forthcoming. So keep up the fight. Is that the message? Did I get that right? So, I'm going to ask Laure Coudray-Lot to join me. She's the director of the Erasmus Plus agency. Karine Gloanec-Morin, she's a regional councillor for the Central Val de Loire region in charge of Europe and international cooperation, former MEP. Lamia Kerjana, she's the president of Young Doctors of the Paris region. Gaëtane Nocturne, she's a practitioner and a professor in the International Relations Commission at the Medical Faculty of Paris-Saclay. Sylvie Retailleau, she's the chair of the University Paris-Saclay. Franck Roland, who's the vice president in charge of quality of life at the ISNI, the intern or residents association in France, and Sirima Tabash from the Free University in Brussels, spokesperson for the CIMAX. And I'll give the floor to Jean Sibylia, he's the dean of the medical faculty in Strasbourg, and Véronique Lecointe, she's the president of the conference of trainers for midwives. Many thanks. We're running a little late, so we'll move on straight away with this roundtable. Just a quick word by way of introduction. After the words of Cohn-Bendit, we understood that we have to party right afterwards. We do not have much time. But to add to what's just been said, if we want people to love Europe and to buy into Europe, we have to give them reasons to love Europe. There won't be any. There's no potential for Europe without young people. Europe. So we have to teach them how to love what we're going to pass on. And I like the idea of a mythology and of giving meaning. Maybe what we lack are myths and mythology and the myth of traveling and voyage. Think of Ulysses, and that brings back some much needed romanticism. I think we who are not young anymore, those travels around Europe, and that it's about you being better trained and about you being happier. We need happiness. We've seen how much we craved for it over the last couple of years, and we want you to flourish. And I want to remind you of some facts. We didn't wait for COVID to do that. The Caen appeal, we got together at the round table in Caen, and we imagined that appeal, that Caen appeal, which was to try and mobilize students around Europe. So I can't say we had anticipated what happened afterwards, but we we started reflecting back then. And it was my pleasure to write an op-ed with the president of ISNI, and it was calling upon a shared citizenship, so share a common good in Europe. This is my introduction. I think we need more discovery, more exchanges, opening up to others, discovering others, founded on yet the same values, ethics, scientific precision and rigor. And this is very important because it's a common language as well, scientific language. And Europe has that added value, I think, and it's a value that we can share. Those are a few words of introduction just to launch this panel discussion. Two parts, Véronique, a part in which you'll be given 5 minutes for some free expression, but you understood that there was an after with Daniel Cohn-Bendit partying time afterwards. But then the second part will be questions. We've already exchanged about questions, but I think there are more questions forthcoming. And I know that there are 6 of you, but Ms. Gloanec is following us remotely. Ms. Gloanec, you're here?
Je suis avec vous depuis tout à l'heure.
Yes, I joined us a moment ago. Okay, we'll launch the panel discussion, and I'll give the floor to Laure Coudray-Lô for a very simple reason. You represent Erasmus, so give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and we give you the floor first. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us as the Erasmus Plus agency representatives. I steer Erasmus Plus in Bordeaux, and I've done so for 4 years. Just in response to what was said before, quickly, Erasmus Plus is the new program for the 2021-2027 period, and a program for which financing has been increased thanks to our members of European Parliament by 80%. European programs, so amongst European programs, it's one of the rare ones that have thus seen their financing increase. Secondly, we need to start very young to nurture that desire and attraction for Europe, and we develop mobility for very young students indeed in primary schools, and it's something that we need to really get to grips with and embrace fully. Beginning of last year, we started looking at the different courses of studies, and we realized that there was one course of studies in particular. It was that of medical studies as well as medical and social sector. It's specific because that's the course of studies where we have the least mobility. I'm looking at Erasmus Plus because I can only speak for Erasmus+, but that gives you an idea. So that's the sector in which students are least mobile. It's a bit complicated because we have statistics that are not very refined, so they lump together health and well-being. So we really, it's really quite wide. So in across the 7-year period, from 2013 to 2020. So if we look at mobility, out of 7,000 people who were mobile, 6,300 left, and inflowing mobility, 9,000 people came to France in this sector. So it is a specificity. You are the only sector in which we have more people incoming than people outgoing. That is a difference for compared to other courses of studies or other sectors. And to give you a rough idea, mobility from 2014-2020 in commerce, administration and law, 93,000, engineering 52,000, so a significant gap. So in 2018-2019, only 2% of students in the health sector are mobile, whereas 12.5% of all students were mobile. So, of course, training does not benefit from that financing that is left for others. I don't want to be a pessimist, but one thing needs to be said. There are positive signs. We think that what initiated that there was a reform of the education code that made it possible to factor in mobility. There was the whole reform around universities, and I think that was an important element. And what we saw also is progress, so outgoing mobility, a rate of progression outside of 2019 plus 40%, and incoming mobility 20%, so much lower.
With respect to progress, progress includes the training placements, and this has been driven by the training sessions and the so-called IFC sessions. Looking at all universities in the aggregate on health and health-related pathways, basically we have 13 universities with a bit more than 100 students engaged in mobility, so very few students, with some university having no students on mobility. And it is the paramedical pathways which are the most engaged. We have the Rhône-Alpes region near Marseille in terms of geographies, which has the greatest number of students on mobility. You have universities, you have the IFC students, and you have a specific health-related training organization which uses the Erasmus Plus program. So much for mobility and only mobility. You may know that Erasmus Plus programs has developed cooperation partnerships in the field of health, and then the results are more positive because all stakeholders have been able to choose and select parts of the programs and have been using the Erasmus Plus program successively. Now, I will give the floor to the president of the Paris-Saclay University, which has been able to use the Erasmus Plus program. She'll tell us more about this. We also have a cooperation partnership agreement, which has proved very active, and one speaker will tell us about what the Clermont-Auvergne University has been doing, as it has developed education pathways in dental sciences. We have the medical faculty of Paris, which has been working on developing exchange programs and activities between France and Uganda in Africa. We also have Moinbus, Erasmus activities, knowing that the Erasmus program is a good example of what can be done with Erasmus Mundus activities, and the University of Bordeaux has been active in this respect. And let me mention a few more, because this reflects a true desire for more collaboration. We have the School of Higher Studies in Public Health, which has been using these partnerships very actively with the Jean Monnet Chair, and they've been working with 7 universities for a master's program for any student wanting to engage in public health education pathways. So basically, the general assessment is that there doesn't seem to be a comprehensive and shared strategy of what can be done with Erasmus plus programs and activities with these disciplines, but there is some progress, there is some positive change, which has to be strengthened. Now, barriers and obstacles. Well, you heard about them. Students, whom we heard mention some, as part of obstacles which we've identified. You have the issue of language skills and the lack of recognition by faculty as well. This was mentioned in the previous panel session. The students said so. It is a reality. And also, there are basically insufficient human resources to support these activities and projects and to provide support and assistance to the students who want to engage in mobility programs. So as deans, you have to think more about these aspects and these issues so that you can inject more financial resources and human resources to support these mechanisms and these programs, and possibly also in the university or hospitals that more financial and human resources be devoted. So it is now high time, knowing that a budget of 28 billion euros will be available for the period 2021-2027 as part of the program. And we at the agency will be supporting you, and our teams at the agency will be supporting you in the higher education sector.
Merci, madame.
Thank you. Madame Gloadec-Morin, you now have the floor.
Voilà. Vous avez la parole.
You have the floor.
Pour votre expérience d'élu et en territoire, en région.
For your experience as a regional elected official. Thank you very much. I'm speaking from Orléans, the capital city of my region, as I'll be inaugurating the so-called Europe Direct venue, which is basically the regional information center for youth. And this is very much connected with what we've heard this morning and this afternoon around youth, intersected with the European ideals, with the European policies. So I do represent François Bonneau, the chair of the Val de Loire Regional Council, who couldn't be with us today. I was delighted to hear what Enrico Letta and Daniel Cohn-Bendit said, and I must say that the Central French Regional Authority has been very actively engaged in providing information and communication and generating a desire for Europe and an eagerness for Europe with the younger parts of our population, and knowing that local governments and including regional authorities have now the powers and responsibility for informing and communicating on Europe. And we have a sub-Erasmus program, which is called Journeys to Europe, which has been targeting the high schools in our region, so that every youth, every student in the high schools in our region be able to discover towns, cities, and regions of other countries in Europe in order to develop this desire for Europe and this curiosity for Europe. Now, with respect to the health sphere, unfortunately, we have very low population density in terms of the number of doctors, and our doctors are growing older. So there's a high demand of new, more, and younger doctors and medical staff to work in our region, as they are in insufficient numbers, so that we can have more doctors and medical staff settling in our region. Now, this is not directly connected with Europe and the European policies, but via this insufficient number of doctors being present in the region, we've looked into a number of options, making doctors salaried employees of the local governments, setting up medical houses or medical centers, and developing and promoting a number of medical and paramedical skill sets. And I understood what Sylvie Retailleau said earlier. We need to open up above and beyond the existing European mobility programs destined at students. Today, every year, 30 medical students can engage in training outside of France and in other European countries. So it is of critical importance that as part of our education and training programs, we have developed a health and healthcare and health-related pathway of training and education for paramedical careers, like physiotherapists, like massage specialists, and other types of disciplines, and the regional authority will resort to these facilities and these pathways. And we also have increased the number of training and education organizations and institutes. And remember that we told you that our regional authority had powers and responsibility for allocating European funding as part of the Erasmus program and other European level programs. And I was a European member of parliament at some point, but still today I am still a member of the Committee of Regions, and within the Committee of European Regions we advocate the European framework of social rights, which still remains to be implemented. And as part of this Committee of European Regions, I participate in a European working group called ERIN, and as part of these activities, the working group is engaged in the Cancer Action Plan as well as the Horizon Europe program. So basically, it's a question of connecting the European framework of social rights and the social and the health related agenda. And there is an EDRF program and related funding to help break away from the isolation and vulnerability and disenfranchisement of some communities and some categories of population. So we have an array of instruments, systems, and mechanisms at hand using the European Social Fund and ERDF facilities. This is how we provide support and assistance, information and communication to youth on the European European policies and ideals, and this is how we fight against and try and remedy the lack of and deficit of doctors and number of doctors in our region. And as part of the toolkit and instruments we have at hand, and Laure Coudray-Law mentioned this earlier when she spoke, we participated in setting up so-called local health-related working agreements with the creation of the University of Tontology in our region, which is of great importance. In addition to the various systems and mechanisms I mentioned, we jointly with the Youth Information and Communication Center have put together special areas of focus so that we can provide the greatest possible assistance and help to the young people. And knowing that the other member states which are engaged in the same issues have developed connections with us and have developed similar efforts. We seem to have some issues with the audio quality and your connections, but we will stop now. If we may, we will take questions and we will come back to you later on during the session. And it is now my pleasure to give the floor to Sylvie Retailleau, whom you all know well as president of Paris-Saclay University. Thank you, Sylvie, for being here. Can you tell us more about your capacity and role as the university president in the mobility of students? Well, thank you for inviting me, Jean. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. The idea was for me to share testimonials and stories of lots of activities and events and initiatives borne by the medical faculties and the various universities, which brings together students, disciplines, and enables experience sharing via the alliances with other European universities. So indeed, in the Paris-Saclay University, we have an agreement with other universities on so-called global health. Now, the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, the Louvre University, and the Segen and Porto University. So 5 universities are making up jointly with ours the so-called European University. So the European University, quote unquote, being basically the representation of 5 universities with representation of universities from the northern part of Europe, the western, eastern, and southern part of Europe. Now, this so-called European University is focused on the students, and initially the European universities were focused on the studies and studying efforts of students, and training, education, and issues of mobility for students are of great importance for students, and sharing is important in this respect, but we need to go further in the field of research and innovation to plan ahead for the future, to develop connection with the businesses, and also the students' life and campus life is of great importance, contributing to sharing on the intersection between studies and the lives of students. So we have a lot on the medical disciplines, but with respect to comprehensive and holistic health, it was important to include all disciplines, and the multidisciplinary factor was of great importance for medical sciences, for health sciences, and for all 21st century discipline. The development of a so-called European citizenship, our youth today are possibly more demanding than we used to be. And I agree with what was said earlier. They are demanding on the quality of their social life and social activities, on the roles they can have and play as citizens, as well as the human and humanistic values of social development, human values, basic values, and they want to have a choice with respect to where they want to work in the private or public sphere in connection with the global planetary issues. And we are fortunate enough to have student boards at the European university level. And as board members, they share in the activities of the governance of university. Now, we have lots of health students, and we realize that in France, our students don't have much time and possibilities to participate in difficulties outside of the remit of their studies. This is what feedback we got compared with other students from other countries. And the fact that these types of activities are not recognized by the universities. So not enough recognition on activities which are outside of their curricula, outside of their studies, letting them engage in these activities without putting their core studies on the sideline. Basically, you have medical and pharmaceutical pathways, paramedical pathways, and then internal medicine pathways. Now, in medical and pharmaceutical students' pathways, these students are very much eager to go on mobility, to experience exchange programs, and to know and discover what is happening outside of France. But the obstacle is basically the density and intensity of their studies. They need to go on exchange programs during year 2 or year 3 because their studies get more demanding after year 3, but we all know that choosing is about giving up on some things, and also the internal stage of their studies, the internal medicine stage of their studies can be a moment when mobility could be envisaged. So basically, during the pathways, during the very steps of their studies, and with the differentiation of profiles, especially at the R1C stage, by including some multidisciplinarity, some cross-disciplinarity in the course of their studies, so that they can engage with and work with other disciplines. These are important moments and possibilities for the so-called paramedic pathways and disciplines. And in preparing for this symposium, we at the European University realized that we hadn't been effective and thorough in some areas of our work, and that we had to do more work on the various profiles and categories of students. And for the paramedic pathways, initial feedback is different. The obstacles connected with languages, with financial resources, and even the desire to go on mobility, these are different aspects and characteristics compared with medical and pharmaceutical students. So it involves and requires more financial support and assistance and resources, so that, and as well as educating staff to provide help and assistance and support to students through training placements, through curricula, and through the mobility programs. And there's the sandwich here, the so-called année de césure in French, the sandwich year, which has to be more developed, which requires being communicated and informed to the students ahead of time, which is not enough. And again, it's about educating and training all our staff with respect to language skills, so that they can speak and communicate with students from the various countries, as well as training in the toolkits at hand. Another example that we developed as part of the European University program, thanks to the pandemic, or due to the pandemics, we developed so-called virtual mobility, quote unquote. Now, what is virtual mobility? Well, number one, we have large numbers of students involved, and I just want to say that, and this is not just in medical sciences, we've been bad in mobility cases for students going outside of France, except for mandatory international placements. And we have lots to do to support our students to engage in mobility the experiences outside of France. This is more efforts to be done for all universities now. Virtual mobility for this large number of students could be useful. We said that there was something which was important. This is social life, partying, evening activities and events, and virtual mobility events and mechanisms which can be used for studies and for classes will never replace the great experience of moving around Europe, of traveling and meeting and mingling with students outside of your culture. So all these tools are very useful, very effective, but will never replace real in-person mobility exchanges. Last point I wanted to add is the notion of flexibility of curricula, flexibility of pathways, and flexibility of equivalent diplomas and qualifications. So we've been engaged in extensive discussions with our German counterparts who are looking at their medical sciences curricula, and this might be a point of for convergence to try and making curricula and diplomas and qualifications and accreditations more compatible and uniform. Thank you for your attention. We will now give the floor to Gaëtan Nocturne. I am being told that we have lots of questions, so please make sure we keep time for question and answer. So Gaëtan Nocturne, in the Paris-Saclay University medical faculty, I'm especially in charge of student mobility, especially for graduate students. I would like to pick up on what Laure Kudrelo said and on the statistics and numbers she shared with lower mobility for health-related studies. I think that there are two key lessons to be drawn on the outgoing mobility numbers, which are lower. Now, I've been working day in and day out with medical students and health students. I can tell you that they have a high appetite for these mobility experiences. They are very open and sensitive and want to go on mobility. They are curious. They want to discover the other cultures. And it is not incidental that these young men and women engage in medical studies and in health-related studies. So there is really personal appetite on a more personal and professional level. They want to go on mobility to create a European framework, a European platform for health. If we want to create European solidarity and a real health platform at the European level, it needs to be promoted by way of these mobility events. Now, what are the obstacles? Several of these obstacles were addressed and mentioned. You have the obstacle connected with the lack of harmonization and the need for harmonization, but I'll be quite optimistic with the possibility to harmonize. Number one, we need to understand that as part of health-related studies, there are two key factors. There's the teaching of knowledge, theoretical knowledge, and teaching of practical skills. With respect to theoretical knowledge, the scholarly associations and societies in Europe have taken the lead on providing the curriculum of theoretical knowledge, and the models across Europe will be standardized at some point. And with respect to the teaching of skills and practical skills, we'll be discussing what has been introduced with respect to the reforms of graduate studies in the medical disciplines, and this will be a major step towards encouraging mobility experiences. Now, what I liked in what Laure Kudre said is that our medical studies and health studies are attractive because there are more students coming in than students going out in health-related studies. And this is encouraging because health studies in France are basically mentoring and sponsored type of training with training placements and apprenticeships with a large vocational part, which is important during the training. And it's important that we standardize this across Europe with the development of new tools on the teaching of practical skills, including simulation tools, which have taken on a larger share and role across Europe, and this is of extremely great importance. And the last point before I give the floor to another speaker, the topic of this panel session is entitled Mobility and Well-being for Students. And this topic is of importance and needs to be understood in two ways. Mobility can be a source of student well-being because there's appetite of students for sharing, for exchanging, and for mobility experiences. Conversely, we don't want to force mobility. Mobility needs to be a choice for it to be experienced with fun and peace of mind and pleasure. And as was said, medical studies are very long-term studies, lengthy ones, so we need to encourage mobility experiences at various steps. You have the undergraduate, you have the graduate, you have the postgraduate, including the internal medicine steps. There are various steps which can be envisaged when mobility experiences can be promoted. I don't have the numbers in mind, but when you look at internal doctors who take sandwich years and sabbaticals years to go and travel around the world is of importance, and this should be encouraged and promoted and should be framed within some kind of a European level regulation and guidelines. Thank you, Madame.
Merci Gaëtan.
Thank you, Gaëtan Nocturne, for your contribution. You are very young, but you got engaged in your university. Let us give the floor to Franck Roland, who is the Vice President for Quality of Life at the ISNI organization, which is the Federation of Internal Doctors Association in France. I took advantage of the mobility experience at Paris-Saclay University as an internal doctor in the psychiatric discipline by engaging in a master's program in medical sciences. So I had a double curriculum, double diploma to be a clinical psychologist as well, on top of being a trained psychiatrist. So I really believe in the possibility of taking bits and pieces of various disciplines so as to build up a profile which will feed into our research activities and into our clinical activities. As this was not enough, at night I'm involved in students' lives and students' events, including in our students' organization ISNI. And for 2 years, I was a member of the management board of the former CNA, which is the National Center for Supporting and Assisting the lives and the social events of French students, which may be a specific feature of the French higher education spheres. In 2017, some student associations warned that there were issues with the psychological health of students. There was a report by Dr. Mara, who's a psychiatrist, who published a report with 15 recommendations, one of them being to create the National Center for Supporting Health students in their lives and in their activities on the campus. And it was a three-party organization with student representatives, faculty representatives, and some special personalities with some skills and expertise in this area, including European and non-European professionals and specialists, including a representative from Canada, knowing that Canadians have a very different culture with respect to quality of life, teaching skills, and so on and so forth. So for 2 years, the so-called CNA worked hard, and 2,500 students were trained, both student and faculty alike, in student activities and social lives, with 5 recommendations, like what measures to take when a student passes away, what support and assistance mechanism should be introduced in universities, with dozens of students at psychological distress being supported and assisted, and a report, the CNACO report, which was conducted. In the last 2 years, we had the COVID pandemic, pandemic, which affect us all. And during the pandemic, we are able to conduct 2 surveys for all health-related studies with 1 year apart during the first lockdown. And the last survey was conducted a few months ago. And on a quantitative and qualitative level, what we found is that, and this won't be a surprise, there was an explosion of distress with these students. With 30,000 respondents a year ago, more than 50% of students said they were at a psychological distress. And a few months ago, with the latest survey, 80% stated that they were distressed psychologically, with a number of root causes, precariousness, isolation, and also the fact that they are freshmen. Health students have this specific characteristic of being studying at university and also in direct contact with the healthcare professionals and patients and involved in healthcare. And this is a specific feature which the COVID pandemic revealed and which has to be taken on board.
Another element is that 15% of them think at one point of giving up on their studies. So those are observations that are pretty sad. And we're coming close to 10 deaths among residents as well this year. So when you look at COVID as well as working conditions, this is true also abroad. If you look at former pandemics, we know that the repercussions in terms of anxiety, depressions, addictions, and sleeping problems, that usually happens from 1 to 3 years afterwards. So it is a pressing matter. The question of this, the pain, the distress is a pressing matter, and there's a lot we can learn from our friends in Europe and abroad. I think these work has been very valuable indeed, and this National Centre for the Quality of Life of Students has been disbanded and has been thanked for its valuable work. But I think that centre has achieved really something and fulfilled its mission. It is as important to look at the psychological aspects rather than looking at strong students and weak students. I mean, that's not the way it actually works. There's a real ethical challenge here, which has to do with the training of healthcare professionals, future healthcare professionals, and their well-being, because we can safely assume that those who have a certain degree of well-being will stand a better chance of becoming good healthcare professionals. Thank you very much for this presentation and for sharing your knowledge about those support schemes as well as of students. I'm now going to give the floor to Sarima.
Bonjour.
Tabash, yes, hello. Thank you for your kind invitation.
Présidente de Jeunes Médecins Île-de-France.
Sorry, I'm Lamia Kirjana, the president of Young Doctors of the Paris region, and I also am and I want to share a memory with you. A student, second-year student, who came to support us during the first wave.
Mostly because
she thought it was her role to do it, and also a little bit because it would help her pay her rent. She had only had a crash course of 2 hours, and she was in tears the first evening, in tears the second evening. There was a lot of distress and a lot of calling into question her calling. And we tried to reassure
Pendant cette
her.
période de pandémie,
And
la
during the
formation des étudiants en
pandemic,
santé et des
the
étudiants en
training
médecine a été
of
fortement
medical
impactée.
students has been
Ils ont été
greatly
réquisitionnés
impacted.
dans des
They were
services surchargés,
requisitioned
souvent
in
immergés dans des
saturated
services de réanimation sans formation préalable, souvent
departments
cantonnés à des
without
activités
any
répétitives
prior training, often
et
asked to do
qui étaient
repetitive
sans lien avec leur
tasks
formation. Ils ont
without
vu les
any
hôpitaux absorber
link
le
with
flux
their
d'afflux
training.
massive de malades au détriment de leur formation et de leur santé.
And they had to
La formation
help
des jeunes
manage
praticiens,
the flow of
pas autant les internes et les étudiants en santé, mais
patients.
surtout les jeunes
So
praticiens
I
de
represent
clinique,
young practitioners.
qui ont vu également leur formation
And they
bouleversée
saw
avec la
their
fermeture,
training
alors notamment
also
des blocs opératoires, la
overwhelmed with
réattribution des lits
the
d'hospitalisation pour des
closing
patients
of
atteints de
some
la Covid,
operating
au détriment de leur propre
rooms,
spécialité.
operating theatres,
Il a fallu attendre avril
and they've had to
2021 pour
move
que le
on
ministère
to
de
new
l'Enseignement supérieur
tasks
limite
to
la
the
durée
detriment
de
of their own
réquisition en un
specialty.
mois, par période de 15
And
jours,
they were
renouvelable une fois.
requisitioned for a
cela,
month,
ne concerne pas bien
several
sûr les
times.
jeunes praticiens. Néanmoins, le fonctionnement de l'hôpital repose en
And
trop
sometimes
grande
for longer
partie
periods,
sur les étudiants en
the
santé
way
pour
hospitals
pallier les insuffisances de recrutement en personnel, et cela a des
really
répercussions
relies too much
au-delà
on
des temps de
young
crise.
medical students,
Cela a des répercussions,
especially so in
bien
a
sûr,
time of
sur la
crisis.
qualité de leur
It has
formation,
an impact on the quality
mais
of their
aussi sur leur
training,
bien-être pendant
but
leurs
also on their well-being during
Il
their
reste encore beaucoup à
training.
faire pour
There's
vraiment
still
prendre
a
en compte le
lot
bien-être
to
étudiant.
be done to
Il
factor
reste
in the
encore plus à faire
well-being
pour que le bien-être soit
of
pris en compte sur
students
l'ensemble de la carrière.
and the well-being throughout their career.
Il suffit, entre guillemets, de bien parler et de bien penser avec bienveillance.
So for
Mais quel sens a la bienveillance si elle s'arrête aux portes de
So
l'université?
for
la
better
bienveillance, elle s'arrête à
well-being,
la
we need a
nationalité.
lot of goodwill
Faut-il
and
rappeler que les conditions de
kindness,
vie des étudiants étrangers
but
en France
the
ont été encore
condition,
plus
the
difficiles
living
pendant la
conditions
pandémie que
of
pour les étudiants
foreign
nationaux.
students in
Bien
France
sûr,
have
cela
been
n'est
even
pas valable
worse
pour
than for French medical students, and that's
cela
not
permet de
true
faire le lien avec la
only
question de la
of the time of
mobilité.
crisis, and that
Pour nous, la
makes it possible for me
mobilité
to
au cours des
draw a
études de
link
santé
with the
devrait être
question
la
of
règle,
mobility.
dès
We
le deuxième cycle
think
d'études médicales.
that
Mais ne devrait pas être un
mobility
parti
should
du
be the
combattant
rule, and it
administratif et
should not be
financier.
an obstacle course
Elle devrait
in
être
terms of
institutionnalisée,
administration and
pris en main
financing.
et
It
valorisée.
should be institutionalized,
Moi,
a turnkey
dans mon
solution, and it should be
expérience,
valued and
plus le nombre de
promoted.
fois où
In
j'ai
my
entendu un
experience,
PIPH dénigrer les pratiques de ses homologues sous prétexte qu'ils n'étaient pas français.
I cannot count the number of times, the sheer number of times I've heard a practitioner deride the practices of colleagues because they were foreign. And it's even true of people
L'autre et l'ailleurs sont vilipendés.
saying derogatory things about people from other regions in France or even separate parts of the same city.
Comme en parle très bien le professeur Emmanuel Lansac dans sa tribune parue en 2014. Je vous remercie.
And I thank you for your attention. We still have a way to go to ensure the well-being of young practitioners. Thank you very much, Lamia, for your testimony, and thank you for talking about the poverty in which a lot of medical students find themselves. So we wanted to have a cross-border discussion. To that end, we'll give the floor to our nearest neighbors and cousins. So thank you, Sarima, for sharing with us the experience in Brussels. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Let me introduce myself. It will be quick. My name is Sarima. I'm a resident in pediatrics. In Belgium, we don't call it a residency, but I am a spokesperson and part of an association that represents residents in Belgium. And our objective is also to promote quality of well-being in the healthcare sector. I want to thank all my colleagues for talking about mobility, and I want to emphasize once more the question of well-being for residents and medical students. The message I wanted to get across is that all that research and innovation, all those scientific advances are great, of course, and to be celebrated, but if you don't care for the people, men and women who are going to actually really implement all those great advances, what use is it? So, to for the health of the population, for the robustness of the healthcare sector, you need healthcare professionals who are in good health. And I remember the beginning of the first wave when people would give a clap to caregivers every day at 8 p.m. in France. And bear in mind that we're at the beginning of a climate crisis, so we should be ready for forthcoming pandemics, and I don't think we are ready. The working conditions and conditions for training of medical practitioners in Europe outside of a pandemic are not worthy of the 21st century Europe, and it's not compatible with a robust healthcare system and with thriving people in their social life. We work an average of 60 hours per week. It often reaches 100 and 120 hours per week. We still have to work 24 consecutive hours, even without having time to eat or to go to the toilet. In Belgium, maybe there wasn't a lot of media coverage, but a few months back there was a revolt on the part of residents, and the slogan was the following sentence: would you go on a plane with a pilot who hasn't slept for 20 hours, because that's what you're doing with medical practitioners. And I think what the ISNI did, the residents' associations did, in terms of trying to get the media to talk about the number of suicides. And I wanted also to talk about a study from 2015 of the WHO, over 55 hours of 55 weekly hours. The risk of mortality is higher. The risk of strokes and ischemic cardiopathies is much higher. So to conclude, I think in Europe in 2021, the problem is not motivation of young people to engage in medical studies. I think there are lots of people who are really motivated in studying for long years and who want to do so much, but a lot of them stop even before starting, even though they have the calling, because it's too hard for their health. So I think we have a duty and the power to ensure the health of students and young medical practitioners, and we probably need a reform of the system to ensure that. Thank you.
Merci Serena.
Thank you, Sarima. I think that goes to show that the problem is transnational and European, and that's what we want to talk about in this panel discussion. How can Europe help? So Erasmus helps us cross barriers, but problems, no barriers, no frontiers, no borders, and psychosocial risks also.
D'accord. Écoute, moi la première question, je vais la poser à Madame
The first question is Mr. Gloanek.
Peut-être le temps qu'elle revienne, on la posera après.
Maybe we'll keep it for later. Time for her to be back. So I'll ask the question to
sur la place des outils du numérique.
The lady on my left, the role played by digital tools in Erasmus.
Alors dans les changements,
well, as part of the changes for the 2021-2027 period, there's a lot of things that are going to be able to make it possible to speed up mobility. There will be a digital Erasmus that will make it possible for hospitals and institutions, universities, to have a lot more possibilities for the mobility mobility of their students. And for students, it will be a lot easier to organize their mobility with an app that they will have on their smartphone. This is going to change the life of both educational institutions and students. Secondly, there's the question of hybrid mobility for the healthcare sector and the social sector. Will make it possible to have gap years or times in a course of studies for mobility.
Ce GIP qui nous a approchés, qui s'appelle UNES. C'est un GIP qui
UNES, which is a GIP,
on va dire le patrimoine des cours qui existent.
That retrieves all the heritage of classes that exist, and I think there's a lot to be done on new models that can integrate everything that already exists and make it possible for students who leave to have a lighter load and increased well-being when they choose mobility, so that they can make the most of the times they spend abroad. That hybrid mobility can be a plus for the whole sector and improving the tools that will make everybody's life easier.
On a les questions de la salle, comme on dit.
We have the questions from the audience, but there was a question about Brexit that was asked this morning. What will be the impact of Brexit on the Erasmus in terms of financing, or is it going to be an important impact? Well, our friends from the UK are no longer with us. They stayed on Horizon 2020. They are no longer part of Erasmus+, but with Erasmus+, you can work with all the countries in the world. And one of the new features of inter-European Erasmus and global Erasmus, thanks to European financing, you can have 20% of mobility with the rest of the world, up to 20% of mobility with the rest of the world. So you can go on working with them. You can go on working with the UK, but of course that's a very small share of your financing, only 20%.
Mobilité, merci.
Question from the audience about mobility. There's a lot of talk about mobility in training, but do you think there is a certain degree of mobility during internships or work placements? Because these internships and work placements are very important for the transfer of skills and the training of students. Sylvie and then Gaëtan, yes, I think so. The answer is yes. And I was talking about several German universities. They want to introduce more work placements and internships, and they're really interested in doing it as part of a mobility effort. And we discuss that a lot and see how we could have more work placements and internships, and that can allay certain fears when in a course there's always a test, whereas in a work placement or an internship, it's also part of your training. Absolutely, and I can only concur with what Sylvie has just said. We have to make the most of that lever we can play upon. For medical studies in general, there's the R2C reform, the reform of the second cycle of studies. Not the first 3 years, but the following 3 years. So it is very important to look at what's being done in our European neighbors. And there's a real capacity for French universities to welcome people and open up work placements. And that includes a first round of work placements, then a second round round of work placements in the clinical field, and we have a real opportunity with new tools that are being made available. I'm thinking of a new partnership between Paris-Saclay University and a German university with a database for training in the healthcare sector. The EcoVIP is its name, so we have to support mobility with work placements. One last comment, just a quick comment. We should also make sure that the deans meet other European deans so that these work placements, these internships can really be implemented. That's absolutely essential. Well, the really last word, Lamia. Well, it's a question. We talk a lot about students, but I'm thinking of people who have already done their residency, and mobility is often required. And we've conducted a study. We're going to publish the results shortly. And mobility is one of the cause for people to give up on a hospital.
Les freins étaient l'absence de financement des mobilités en post-internat,
post-residency hospital
en second venait la famille, et puis en troisième la lourdeur administrative. Donc il y a un vrai enjeu autour de ça.
There's a real challenge in terms of mobility. There are several obstacles.
J'ai la baïonnette dans le dos de Pascal.
Well, Pascal has, almost has me at gunpoint, asking me to wrap up. So, as Daniel Cohn-Bendit said, the party goes on. We haven't had time to take all the questions, but many thanks to everybody.